Some people say that the Australian real estate bubble has grown as big as Japan's in the 1990s and that it's just waiting to burst. So, is this really the case, or is it just alarmist talk? I spent over 20 hours gathering data, thoroughly comparing Japan's housing market back then with Australia's current market. The conclusion I reached was quite unexpected. Without exaggeration, I am the first blogger on the internet to provide such a comprehensive comparison of the two countries' real estate markets. If you see information or data elsewhere that differs from mine, please refer to my findings as the standard. All the data comes from official sources. I am Jin Swan Xian, here to help you look at Australian real estate through the lens of data. First, let's start with some background information. Japan's real estate bubble lasted from 1985 to 1991. After the Plaza Accord, the yen appreciated sharply. To cope with the economic pressure caused by declining exports, the government adopted an extremely loose monetary policy, which led to an unprecedented real estate bubble. The burst of this bubble directly resulted in Japan's so-called lost 30 years. Meanwhile, Australia's real estate market has experienced several major upswings since the year 2000, especially in the two main cities of Sydney and Melbourne, where the driving factors are very complex. Factors such as immigration policies, a relatively loose credit environment, taxation, and cultural preferences have all contributed to the continuous rise in real estate prices. The debate over whether Australian real estate is a bubble has been ongoing since 2008. To determine whether an asset has entered a bubble phase, we first need to define what a bubble is. I will provide 4 indicators. First, the degree to which asset prices deviate from their intrinsic value. Second, the degree of credit looseness. Third, market speculation. And fourth, supply and demand. Let's look at them one by one. First is how much asset prices deviate from intrinsic value. This perspective assesses if housing prices have far exceeded their value as a place to live. After all, housing is for living, not speculation. The first sub-indicator is the rent-to-price ratio. For example, in Tokyo, Japan at that time, the rent-to-price ratio reached. At the peak of the bubble, a Tokyo apartment could have a rent-to-price ratio under 1%, meaning it would take 187 years of rent to recover your purchase cost. What about Australia? Take Sydney, which has the lowest rental yields. The rental yield for detached houses in Sydney is 2.7%, and for apartments it's 4.6%, corresponding to rent-to-price ratios between 22 and 37. As we see, in terms of this indicator, although Australia's rent-to-price ratio is exaggerated, it hasn't become completely detached from fundamentals like Japan did. The second point is the proportion of land value in the transaction price. Back then, there was something crazy about Tokyo's land prices. They were driven up to such an extent that selling Tokyo could buy all of the United States. In contrast, in today's Australia, if we look at newly built homes, the land cost usually accounts for only 50 to 60% of the transaction price. This is also because, after the pandemic, construction costs in Australia have kept rising, but the conclusion is the same. In both countries, land value makes up a high proportion of the transaction price, but Australian real estate is far from Japan's asset bubble, when scarce land prices became detached from use and turned into financial instruments. Let's look at the price-to-income ratio. In 1990, it would take an average household in Tokyo 18 years of income without spending a cent to buy an apartment, making it nearly impossible for ordinary families to afford such housing prices. In contrast, let's take Sydney, the least affordable city in Australia, as an example. In 2024, the ratio of Sydney's housing prices to median household income reached 13.8 times, making it the most unaffordable city after Hong Kong. This metric is used to compare Australia's current real estate market with Japan's during the bubble period. This is the most similar aspect and the one we should be most wary of. Looking at the first major indicator, the degree to which asset prices deviate from intrinsic value, Australia's housing market is still some distance from Japan's during the bubble. However, the deterioration in housing affordability is a risk that should not be underestimated. The second point is the looseness of credit. Simply put, it refers to how willing banks are to lend you money to buy a house. There are two main indicators here. The first is the interest rate environment. From 1986 to 1987, the Bank of Japan lowered its official discount rate to a historic low of 3.375%, injecting a massive amount of cheap capital into the market. In contrast, the Reserve Bank of Australia, in an effort to rescue the economy, during the pandemic, it lowered interest rates to 0.1%. But once the pandemic was over, in order to tackle inflation, it began raising rates sharply from 2022, and by the end of 2024, its official discount rate had reached 4.35%. The conclusion is that both countries have experienced very loose credit environments, but the Reserve Bank of Australia actively stepped on the brakes, while the Bank of Japan did so to cope with export pressures, and the European Central Bank did it to curb inflation. It was precisely this crucial braking action that prevented further bubble formation in the Australian real estate market. The second point is the accessibility of loans. In simple terms, how strict banks are in reviewing borrowers' qualifications. Back in Japan, under the influence of the land myth, it was very easy to obtain a loan. Most importantly, non-bank institutions also participated in lending, which further increased the financial risks of the entire system. In contrast, Australia has a dedicated regulatory body like APRA. APRA reviews the risk control capabilities of major banks, and banks have clear standards regarding borrowers' income. It's not simply a matter of having an asset to use as collateral for the bank to lend you money. As a bank, I still need to prove that you can repay the loan through your income, not to mention the stress tests imposed on banks by regulatory agencies. Therefore, the degree of looseness or tightness in the credit market is very different between the two countries. Japan's recklessness stands in stark contrast to Australia's mature regulatory system. Australia has a mature and proactive review mechanism, which is also what protects Australian assets. The final firewall. The third point is to look at the level of speculation. Simply put, do people buying houses truly believe that real estate has value, or are they just looking to make a quick profit and get out? To answer this, we need to look at the market sentiment. Although this indicator is very difficult to quantify, we can still get a glimpse from some historical records. During Japan's real estate bubble, people generally believed that land would never depreciate. From individuals to corporations, everyone believed that land prices would always rise, so they bought land purely for the future, expecting it to appreciate so they could sell for a profit. As for the current Australian housing market, there are also a large number of speculators who try to time the market by buying properties in different cities or even small towns, hoping for rapid appreciation in the future to accumulate wealth. However, due to the continuous influx of new immigrants, the demand for owner-occupied housing remains very strong, so it's not entirely speculative. In conclusion, Japan's market at that time was already completely dominated by investors. However, the European real estate market still has an owner-occupier factor, which anchors the second quantifiable indicator, the proportion of investors. This actually surprised me quite a bit. Even during Japan's bubble period, 60% of buyers were still owner-occupiers. If you look at Australia now, it's quite similar. According to data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2021, the proportion of owner-occupiers in real estate is as high as 67%, which is similar to Japan back then and Australia now. Most people still buy houses to live in themselves. So what exactly went wrong in Japan back then? It was something very rare. Large corporations also got involved in real estate speculation. A huge number of companies used the money they earned from their main businesses to speculate in real estate. Even bank loans were preferentially given to these big corporations. As a result, although the proportion of owner-occupiers buying homes was high, that small group of speculators had overwhelming financial power. Let me share a story here. Japan's century-old Yamaichi Securities was exposed for misusing funds to speculate in real estate. Eventually, its capital chain broke and the company collapsed. There's a book called Den-kun I recommend. It tells the story of Yamaichi Securities at that time and shows how few employees displayed humanity. In Australia, it's rare for companies to speculate in real estate. You wouldn't expect a husband and wife coffee shop to get a bank loan and go on a real estate spree. Buying one or two properties might happen, but they can't get high leverage to speculate on land. Even if the share of owner-occupiers and investors is similar in both countries, the type of investors differs greatly. In Japan then, large-scale, enterprise-led land speculation with huge capital was common, while in Australia, most investors are individuals. The last point is supply and demand. The number of people and housing supply are the main factors behind rising real estate prices. Let's examine these, starting with population structure and growth. At that time, Japan's population growth had slowed, and aging was already a major issue. From the population pyramid, you can see that at that time, the main demographic was already middle-aged people between 40 and 44 years old. In another 10 years, they would actually be entering early old age. And the number of people in their 30s was not keeping up. In contrast, Australia has strong population growth, mainly due to the intake of immigrants. It's hard to imagine, but Australia is actually one of the fastest growing developed countries in terms of population. From this population pyramid, you can see that immigrants to Australia, especially from Greece, are often concentrated in the 25 to 45 age range. They either come with money or they come with the ability and skills to make money. That's why Australia's real estate market is supported by genuine housing demand, unlike Japan back then, where everyone already owned several homes and buying more was meaningless. The second point is housing supply. In Japan, during the bubble period, the supply of housing increased frantically because soaring prices led to an unprecedented boom in the construction industry. A large number of new homes entered the market, and after the bubble burst, these projects resulted in a huge surplus supply. It took many years for this surplus to be absorbed. In contrast, in Australia today, there is a long-term shortage of housing supply due to complicated approval processes, high construction costs, and a shortage of labor. All these factors have combined to create a situation where houses simply can't be built. Even though the government ambitiously set a target of building 1.2 million homes, after a year, the actual gap between the target and reality has already reached 66,000 units. Not only that, public opinion polls show that people's confidence in whether these homes can actually be built has dropped to rock bottom. So, when it comes to the supply and demand relationship, Japan and Australia are worlds apart. Back then, Japan had insufficient demand and an oversupply, while Australia now faces excessive demand and insufficient supply, just on this point alone. This ensures that in the short term, Australia's housing market is unlikely to see a collapse. So, looking back at these four indicators, we can see that there is still a significant gap between Australia's real estate market and Japan's during its bubble period. In addition, Australia has a much stronger demographic foundation, a more cautious credit system. The deviation between property prices and their actual value is not as extreme, and most investors are individuals rather than corporations. However, we can't say that there is no bubble at all in Australia's real estate market. There is undoubtedly a risk of declining affordability in the Australian housing market. So, compared to the cliff-like crash Japan experienced back then, the future of Australia's real estate market may involve a prolonged stagnation or a slow correction due to persistently high interest rates, population growth failing to keep up, and economic weakness rather than a catastrophic collapse. However, if a global black swan event were to occur, preventing immigrants from coming to Australia, the risks posed by the current high leverage and overvaluation in Australia's housing market should not be underestimated. So do you think the Australian housing market will follow the same path as Japan? Leave a comment below and let me know. I'm Jing Xuanxian, your property advisor here in Melbourne. Please like and follow us, and I'll see you in the next episode.